20 minutes after 5 o'clock is where we're at. It's Thursday, the 4th of May. It's so good to be with you. If you've just joined us, a very good afternoon to you. I'm hoping that you've been having a good day so far. If not, I hope it gets better. I've got some great music that's still lined up for you between now and when we wrap it up at 6 p.m. I've got some Marianne J. George that's still coming up. I also see some Tim Godfrey that's loaded before we get to 6 o'clock. But right now, a very important conversation to be had, especially if you're a parent. This is where I'll encourage you to just maybe lean in a little bit closer to join us into this discussion. As you may know, or maybe might not know, there's quite a bit of discussion that's been happening when it comes to the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill that the team at Christian View Network has been in conversation with the Parliamentary Select Committee on Education to speak about some of the problems that they have found in this particular bill, where it involves grabbing power from parents, grabbing power away from parents. And this has been going on in conversation since last year, and various people have been involved, including especially inquiry from the Parliament, and which forced the Department of Basic Education to rethink this particular bill. And their argument is that they argue that parents' control of education is a fundamental right that is granted by God in the Bible and acknowledged by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the Western Cape Constitution, and essential to religious freedom. Now, this has been going back and forth for quite a bit of time, from before November 2022 all the way to where we find ourselves today on the 4th of May 2023. Now, this coming weekend, there's going to be discussions about this particular bill and what that means for you and I all over again. And joining me this afternoon to break this down even more, to give us more detail as to what that means for you and I, what that means for parents, what that means coming into this weekend, and what exactly it's going to influence for our children, not just for now, but for years to come, our finances, access to education, access to religious freedom and education freedom, is Philip Rosenthal, who is from the team at the Christian View Network. Philip, thank you so much for making time to be with us this afternoon. How are you doing, sir?
Very well. Hi there.
I think this is something that it seems very big. It sounds very important, but I think a lot of people may have been unaware of what exactly the situation is. Let's start right at the beginning. The Basic Education Laws Amendment. What exactly is this bill about, and why is it so important for me to take note of this?
Okay, well, this is the biggest change in education law in the last 25 years. And so it will probably determine all the other smaller issues that happen in schools for the next 25 years, the next generation, which is your children growing up. And I think a lot of parents are going to say, well, I'm busy, I've got to fetch my kids from school. And so they will say, well, I don't have time to deal with this. But tomorrow, 2 o'clock, Tshwane South, the parliamentary committee is coming to listen to what parents have to say. And if we don't speak up, then the risk is they take more powers away from parents, and then if a parent gets upset about something that's happening in the school, they've got less say about what happens there, especially if the school governing bodies are weakened, if it becomes more difficult to homeschool and more difficult to set up private independent schools. So there's many small battles that are going on all the time, every year, but this is really a big one that's going to determine many of the other smaller battles for the future. They're also going to be having hearings in Johannesburg on Saturday, and then in Brakpan on Sunday. So if you want to see where these hearings are happening, you can go to Facebook Christian View Network page, and you can see that the details are all there. Now I'm going to just explain a few of the issues that are really important.
Yeah.
One is,
please go ahead, because I think you mentioned about the taking of powers. Let me know, what exactly are those powers that we stand at risk of sort of bearing its fruit later if we don't do anything about it now?
Well, I think the biggest one is the control over admissions policy. In other words, what children are accepted into a particular school. Now, we would like to encourage not all schools, but some schools to develop a Christian ethos and a Christian philosophy of education, and then that would hopefully attract people, like-minded people, to kind of go to those schools and who agree with that ethos. This would give the admissions policy to the central state, which then impacts on all the other issues, such as the financial viability, the ethos, the language policy. And it would also lead to potential loss of jobs for teachers who are then paid by extra school fees from certain schools. Then a second problem is that the requirement is that all the governing body members have to declare their financial interests. Now, that is, to me, is an enormous invasion of privacy. The schools don't need to know that, and they say they want to do this to stop corruption. But there's a much simpler way of stopping corruption, which is to say that the parents would have to declare their business with the school if they are doing business with the school, or they would prohibit them from doing business with the school if they're on the governing body. But this is likely to discourage people from wanting to be on that governing body, because there would need to be an enormous database of information, and I doubt whether the Department of Education's even got the capacity to trawl through all of this. More likely, the information could be sold on the dark web by some hacker, and parents are going to say, no, I don't want to have this invasion of privacy, especially people who are business people who would have the skills to input and strengthen that particular school. Then in terms of homeschooling, proposing a 1-year jail sentence for not registering for homeschooling, not registering your homeschooling, which many homeschooling parents don't want to register. They don't want to be controlled by the state. We argue that we don't want anybody to go to jail for homeschooling. And we can prohibit anybody who violently obstructs learners from going to school. But if parents are just homeschooling, they shouldn't be at risk of any prosecution for that. And they're also proposing that homeschoolers would need to hire a consultant to assess the progress of their child. And we would rather say that should be optional, because that's an extra cost that could discourage parents from homeschooling, and rather they should keep a portfolio of evidence. And then if the government wants to check that they are homeschooling, they can look at the portfolio of evidence and see if the child is making the correct progress. But they don't need to pay all the time for consultants, which is, they're already sacrificing one parent's salary usually in order to do that homeschooling. This creates an additional cost. And so then homeschooling would become more for the rich.
Philip, if I may ask, I mean, just to find out, with what you're saying and the picture that you're painting, isn't it making then access to education a little bit harder for parents to be able to reach? School governing bodies are not going to be put together well because of the requirement of declaration of business if you're going to do business with the school. Number two, homeschooling having to be declared, and you don't have that ability from yourself as parent to be able to go without having to say, I need to be able to register it and have the state in my business. Is it in any way hindering in that basic human right of right to education?
Well, I think it is. And there have been incidents already where Department of Education officials have kind of wanted to intrude in, the home, and parents didn't want them to. And so that's led to problems. But this would really give the state more opportunities to intrude. But there's another angle which can also impact, I think, more than just issue of education, also impact on churches, because how many churches do you know that meet in school halls? Okay, and this is going to make the leasing of school halls more difficult. Okay, because they would only be allowed to have a lease for up to a year, which then leaves the church in a very insecure position if that is not renewed at the end of the year. So we would argue that a 3-year lease is more reasonable, or 6 months notice. And the risk is that, come the end of the year, the school can just say, well, cheers, bye. And it's also a case that a lot of private schools and smaller independent schools, a lot of which are usually Christian in nature, they share school fields with public schools, and they pay them for the benefit of the use of that. Again, this is going to make it more difficult for them to share those school fields and swimming pools and such like. And we believe that this should be made easier. It's win-win for the community, for the church, for the independent schools, everything at the moment. And this is just unnecessary and unhelpful. Then another thing is that for the independent schools, and we argue we don't just want independent schools to be for the rich. We want to make it more accessible for people, ordinary people, to be able to go to Christian independent schools. And this would require quarterly financial reports. Now, the difficulty is a small school does not have a full-time financial person to keep quarterly books. And so that, again, I think is unreasonable. An annual report would be more reasonable. And so many of them are just not going to be able to get the paperwork together in order to get a subsidy, which means then they have to charge more, and which means that the less wealthy people then don't have the opportunity to go send their kids to an independent school. So we would really encourage you, please go to these hearings. It's really wonderful that Parliament is coming to the people, but if we don't speak up, then we're going to lose out this opportunity. And then when our organization goes to lobby in the National Parliament, they say, well, we didn't hear from the Christian community that they all affirmed your concerns. So we would be really grateful. Please, 2:00 tomorrow, it's at Mopani Indoor Sports Center in Swanage South. And on Saturday, Johannesburg City Hall at 12:00. On Sunday, 12:00, Sakane Community Hall in Brakpan. But all those details are on our Facebook page. You can check that again. And I think from a biblical perspective, every scripture which is about children is either telling children to listen to their parents or telling parents how to bring their children up. So God clearly gave that responsibility to the parents, not to the teachers. So the teachers have that delegated responsibility from the parents, and we need to tell the government that that authority stays with the parents, and they are the ones who make the decisions on what happens in the schools. We also know that all the schools that are doing well in South Africa are schools that have strong school governing bodies. The schools that are controlled by the state are in a mess. The grass isn't being mowed. They've got problems. And I think that is because when parents get involved, they fix the problems.
And I think many parents can definitely testify to that in terms of the issues that they've experienced with some of the schools in their communities. Philip, maybe just before we wrap up this conversation, make it make sense for me to understand worst case scenario. You've mentioned the elements that you're arguing, and I think I asked this specifically because it's easy for me. You started this conversation saying it's easy for a parent to go, oh my goodness, I don't have the time, I don't have the space, I don't have access to be able to make it there. No, somebody else will go in my place. And you specifically mentioned how important this becomes then for us to be present in these conversations. For me to understand the gravity of it, make it make sense for me. Should churches not be able to rent the facilities at the school? This will impact directly, I'm assuming, the income of that school, number one, that they would be getting, say, for the churches that's coming there. And would it be correct for me to say even the churches that would be using those facilities, it would be left in limbo, and obviously the effect of the communities from the churches that they'd be attending there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that if the hiring of the school hall just kind of lapses at the end of the year, then where's the school going to go? Do they have to go and move to somewhere far away, or some expensive hall, or meet in somebody's home? It's for middle-sized churches that are kind of not quite strong enough to own their own building, school halls are very convenient. They're not being used on Sunday, and it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, most definitely.
So I don't think the government's being malicious. I just think they haven't thought through all of this. We need to speak up.
And I think you're very correct in saying it hasn't been thought through out very well to understand the full-on scale of impact and what it will do, the sort of the domino effect that it will do into the community. Something else that I would love for us to touch on also, that you started off this conversation with, is the control of child's education, parent or state. What's the worst that can happen if parents don't join the school governing bodies? Because somebody else might be listening to this conversation, and for as long as, say, there are 3 kids, 2 of them have matriculated and they've got their last child in school governing bodies have always been there. It's not a picture that they can imagine of what it looks like without a school governing body. What's the worst that could happen if parents aren't involved in those conversations?
Well, I think there's a number of things that can go wrong. One of them is, I think I get complaints from parents all the time about, for example, the kids are being taught immoral sex education, or they're being taught they can change their gender, and they're not happy with that. If you've got a strong school governing body, you can deal with those problems. Otherwise, you can't. But it's also a question of the quality of the education, that we know even in poor areas where the parents are strong and involved, they say, okay, these are the good teachers that we want, and those ones are we don't want when the applicants come along, and they are the ones that get to decide. You start to weaken their powers, and some official in some government building far away is going to make those decisions if the school governing bodies are weak, and likewise if they don't have control over who to choose which pupils come to that school, then you can have a situation where the school weakens and it loses its ethos, and it's forced to admit people who either can't afford to pay the fees for that particular school, or hold to a different viewpoint that doesn't fit with Christian ethos. And so we want parents to be in control of the schools, and we want them to have more powers in the schools, not less powers in the schools.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important thing, because you choose a school based on the ethos of the school, and if you can't have any say or control into how that stays like that, or influence to keep it in that direction. I mean, there's various issues, from the safe sex education that's been scripted, the Western Cape gender identity policy, the learner pregnancy policy, many things that we can speak about. I'm assuming that the school governing body would be able to be in the room and conversating about that on behalf of parents. Before we wrap up our time, Philip, we're completely over time, but I think this is so important. You've mentioned that tomorrow, 2 p.m. at Tshwane at the Mabopane Indoor Center. What can I do right now as a parent? Do I need to physically be there? Is there an email that I send? Is there a petition that I do online? What can I do to be a part of making my voice heard for my children and their children?
Well, you've got these 3 opportunities in Gauteng, tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday, to go along. You need to physically go along, and you can use some of the points that I've raised here. We'll put more information on the Facebook post, which you can use there, and to just raise your concern that parents' influence needs to be maintained in the schools, and we want stronger school governing bodies, not weaker school governing bodies.
100%. Philip, thank you so much for your time, and I'm really trusting that this is going to be something that we'll see many parents actually coming up to the table and saying, this is the voice that I want to be heard for my children's sake, and bring their weight in, so that even though it may be something that they don't have to worry about in the next 2 years, but 20 years from now, and more especially for their children, they will have to fight a much bigger battle with that particular one. And thank you for you and your team for the work that you're doing, and being in those rooms, being in those discussions, being in those meetings with Parliament and the Department of Basic Education on our behalf, and then of course bringing us into that conversation, letting us know of our ability to be able to shift things when it comes to things that relate to our children, and more importantly, I think, our nation and our faith.
Thanks for the stand you're taking.
Fantastic. That is Philip Rosenthal from the Christian View Network, talking to us all things relating to the Basic Education's Law Bill that is due to be passed. And this weekend is a very important weekend, because hearings will be happening. And I think that the simplest way that I can be able to put this, and I think from the press release that the team at Christian View Network has put, actually puts it very well, saying this bill would give a blank check to the Department of Education to create additional regulations to make home education and the work of governing bodies more difficult, which ultimately will influence the quality of school and the quality of education that children will then be receiving. And we don't want to find ourselves in that place. Many questions coming up, and maybe Philip, before I let you go, there's a question that's just came up right now, talking about, does this affect private schooling, or is this specifically just for state-owned schools?
Well, I think the issue of leasing and sharing facilities definitely does impact private schools, because a lot of smaller private schools don't have their own swimming pools and sports fields. But we also have other things that are threatening private independent schools at the moment, but I think that's going to be another conversation. What I've raised now are the key issues, but the thing that will affect independent schools is that making it more difficult to get subsidies.
Yeah.
And so we are arguing a quarterly financial report is too much, annual report is fair.
100%. Philip, thank you so much for your time. And this conversation will be available on our website, impactradio.co.za, that you can be able to go listen to it again and revisit to find out what you are able to do. So tomorrow, 2 p.m. at the Mabopane Indoor Center, you'll be able to join in there. Saturday at the Johannesburg City Hall, and on Sunday in Brakpan at the Tshwane Community Hall. You can be sure to visit the Facebook page of the Christian View Network to be able to get more details as to what you can do, and also more details as to what this means exactly, in case you might have missed some of the points that have come through over there.
This is the Afternoon Drive Show.